The city never sleeps, but sometimes in its darkest corners, injustice thrives in the shadows. Tonight, a young girl takes a wrong turn down an alley, unaware that danger is following close behind. A moment of fear, a test of power. And then, something no one expected happens. Stay until the end to see how the night unfolds. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The city pulsed with its usual rhythm. Honking cars, the glow of neon lights reflecting off wet asphalt, the distant murmur of conversations blending with the hum of traffic. Somewhere, a siren wailed, cutting through the urban noise, but it was nothing unusual. Just another night, another call, another piece of background chaos in a place where life never truly stopped. Sophia walked briskly, her grip tightening around the straps of her backpack. Not too fast, running would make her look suspicious. Not too slow, she couldn't afford to appear vulnerable. 16 years old, caught in the in-between space of childhood and adulthood, she had learned how to move through the city. She knew the rules. Her father used to tell her, "The city is a beast. It tolerates the weak, but it never forgives them." Tonight, she felt the weight of those words pressing against her chest. At first, it was just a feeling. A subtle shift in the air, a faint prickling at the nape of her neck. Nothing obvious, nothing she could pinpoint, but her instincts, those quiet alarms wired into her over years of existing in places like this, were ringing. She adjusted the strap of her backpack, forcing herself to breathe normally. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Not random, not part of the chaotic symphony of the city. Rhythmic, calculated, persistent. She swallowed, keeping her posture straight. Her eyes darted to the nearest storefront, using the reflection in the glass as a makeshift mirror. For a moment, all she saw was the distorted smear of headlights passing by, but then, there, a man. Not just any man. A cop. Her stomach twisted as recognition hit. Officer Grayson. The stories about him circulated in whispers. A shadow that lurked at the edges of conversations, a name spoken with unease. He wasn't the kind of cop people trusted. He was the kind they avoided. The kind who never seemed to face consequences, no matter what people said he had done. No proof, no charges. Just bruises hidden beneath sleeves, quiet warnings exchanged between neighbors, and that lingering understanding that some people were untouchable. Sophia's hands grew clammy. Was he following her? She couldn't be sure. Maybe he was just heading in the same direction. Maybe it was paranoia. Then he sped up. She did too. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her breaths coming faster now. Stay calm, keep moving, don't panic. She glanced at the street ahead. The intersection was crowded, people waiting for the pedestrian light to change. Safety in numbers. If she could just... A turn. Just ahead, a side street. Narrow, dimly lit, but a shortcut to her bus stop. It would shave minutes off her walk. She hesitated for the briefest second, then veered right. Bad choice. The moment she stepped into the alley, she realized her mistake. The sounds of the city muffled, swallowed by the close walls. The air was damp, thick with the lingering scent of rain and something metallic beneath it. The single flickering street lamp above cast jagged shadows across the pavement. For a moment, silence. Then, footsteps. Not fading, following. She didn't dare turn around, but she didn't need to. She knew. He had followed her. The urge to run clawed at her, but her legs felt locked in place. She forced herself to move, to keep walking, but her pulse was hammering in her ears. A boot scraped against concrete. Too close. She spun around. And there he was. Officer Grayson stood at the mouth of the alley, blocking the exit. The dim light sharpened the angles of his face, casting dark hollows beneath his eyes. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about the way he looked at her. A quiet, unhurried amusement, like he had all the time in the world. Sophia's stomach dropped. This wasn't a coincidence. Her body screamed at her to run, but before she could move, he took a single step forward. Just one. And the space between them disappeared. Her breath hitched, the reality of the situation sinking in. The street beyond the alley wasn't far. She could still see the lights, hear the distant hum of passing cars, the murmur of people going about their lives, but no one was looking. She was alone, with him. He tilted his head slightly, studying her reaction. Then, slowly, deliberately, he spoke. "Where are you headed, kid?" His voice was smooth, almost casual, like they were just two strangers making conversation, but they weren't. Sophia swallowed, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "Home." A pause. Then he took another step forward. "Yeah?" A hint of amusement touched his lips. "A little late to be out alone, isn't it?" Her fingers curled into fists. "I'm fine." "Are you?" Another step. Her breath came sharp and uneven now. Her body tensed, muscles coiled, every nerve screaming at her to do something. But she couldn't move, because he was too close now, and she had never felt so trapped. The alley felt smaller now, the air heavier. The city beyond it moved on, oblivious, as if nothing unusual was happening. But Sophia knew. She could feel it in the way her pulse pounded against her ribs, the way her skin prickled with an almost primal warning. She wasn't just imagining this. She wasn't overreacting. She was trapped. Officer Grayson took another step forward, slow, measured, like he had nowhere else to be, like he was in complete control. His presence filled the narrow space, his silhouette stretching under the flickering glow of the single street lamp. Sophia took a step back. His mouth curled at the edges, not quite a smirk, but something close. "Going somewhere?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat had gone dry, her voice locked somewhere deep inside her chest. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly as if disappointed. "You shouldn't be out this late." Sophia swallowed hard, forcing her feet to remain planted even as every instinct screamed at her to run. "I'm just trying to get home," she managed, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. Grayson chuckled. "That so?" Another step. The space between them disappeared too quickly, too easily. She tried to step back again, but her heel caught on uneven pavement. Her balance wavered. She stumbled, and before she could regain her footing, his hand shot out. Fingers clamped down on her shoulder, firm, unyielding. She gasped, her breath hitching in her throat as a jolt of panic surged through her. Then, with a single hard shove, he sent her backward. Sophia hit the ground. Her hands flew out to catch herself, palms scraping against the rough concrete. A sharp sting shot up her elbows, but the pain was nothing compared to the cold shock that spread through her chest. She pushed up onto her forearm, looking up at him. He hadn't moved. He just stood there, watching, studying, like he had all the time in the world. Her breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. The world around her felt distant, like she was moving through a slow-motion nightmare. He tilted his head. "See, now you just made things complicated." Sophia's fingers curled against the ground, her body tense. This wasn't a random stop. This wasn't about curfew or safety. This was about power. He was proving something. To her, to himself, to whoever he imagined was watching, and he was enjoying it. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. No one was coming to stop him. No one was watching. No one cared. She had to do something. She pushed herself up a little more, shifting her weight. If she could just... Grayson moved fast. One step, and he was above her, his shadow swallowing the light. His boot scraped against the pavement. A silent warning. Sophia froze. Her heart was hammering now, the pounding so loud she could barely hear anything else. Grayson exhaled through his nose, fingers tapping against his belt. The movement was casual, too casual, but she wasn't naive. She knew what was on that belt. Handcuffs, a gun, a baton. She knew exactly how this story ended. She had read the headlines, heard the whispered testimonies in community meetings. She knew the kind of man he was. Not just a bully, not just a cop with a temper, a predator. A man who knew that people feared him too much to fight back. And here, in this dark alley, away from the crowds, he had her exactly where he wanted her. Sophia's breath came shallow, erratic. She willed herself to think, to move, to do anything. But fear was a weight, pressing down on her chest, pinning her in place. Grayson sighed, shifting his weight slightly. Then, without warning, he stepped closer. Too close. The shift in power was instant. He wasn't just standing near her, he was above her, crushing, suffocating. Sophia clenched her jaw. She would not just sit here and let this happen. She pushed herself up onto her elbow, her other hand still pressed against the pavement. Grayson's boot shifted slightly. She froze. His hand was still on his belt, his fingers still tapping that same slow rhythm against the baton's handle. A game. That's what this was to him. He wanted her to squirm, to hesitate, to know that he was in complete control. Her fingers scraped against the rough concrete as she tried to push herself up further. Pain flared up her scraped palms, but she ignored it. The silence in the alley was suffocating. Beyond it, the city still moved. Cars honked, voices laughed. The distant rhythm of life continued, as if nothing was happening. But here, in this narrow strip of darkness, time had slowed. Sophia's breathing was shallow, erratic. She willed herself to think, to do something, anything. Her gaze flicked toward the mouth of the alley. The street beyond wasn't far. If she could just... Grayson sighed. He tilted his head slightly, as if reading her thoughts. Then, without warning, he moved. One step. Too close. Sophia's body locked up. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run, but her body refused to cooperate, paralyzed by the sharp, electric current of terror running through her veins. Grayson crouched slightly, resting his hands on his knees. Studying her, his expression was unreadable, but the gleam in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He was enjoying this. Sophia had heard stories about men like him, people, mostly women, who had been cornered, threatened, humiliated, but those stories had always seemed distant, like something that happened to other people. Now she was living one, and just like in those stories, she could already see the ending. A flicker of movement caught her eye. Her breath hitched. A man walking past the alley, his gaze briefly flicking in their direction. Her heart leapt. She opened her mouth, desperate to call out, but before she could, Grayson shifted his weight and his hand dropped to his baton. He didn't even have to draw it. The simple motion, the unspoken "don't even try it," was enough. The passerby hesitated, just for a second. That was all it took. The man turned his head away, kept walking. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She watched the figure retreat, his silhouette swallowed by the bustling street beyond. She wanted to scream after him, to beg for help, but the words wouldn't come, and even if they did, she knew they would be ignored, because this was how it always happened. People saw. They always saw, but they never interfered, and men like Grayson thrived in that silence. The silence in the alley felt heavier now, suffocating. The city beyond it continued, indifferent to what was unfolding within its shadows. The retreating footsteps of the passer-by faded into the distance, swallowed by the hum of traffic and the occasional bursts of laughter from pedestrians moving along their own paths, oblivious. Sophia's chest rose and fell rapidly, her body locked in a mixture of shock and growing desperation. Grayson hadn't moved from where he stood, his fingers still lazily tapping against the handle of his baton, his smirk barely visible under the dim light of the flickering street lamp. She tried to push herself up, her scraped palms stinging as they pressed against the rough concrete. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, for something, anything, that could change the situation. But the weight of realization pressed down on her harder than the pavement beneath her hands. She was alone, completely and utterly alone. Grayson knew it too. His posture was relaxed, his stance unhurried, the way a cat might watch a trapped mouse before deciding what to do next. He had done this before. Maybe not to her, maybe not exactly like this, but she could see it in his eyes. There was no hesitation, no fear of consequences. He was in complete control, and he wanted her to know it. Her pulse roared in her ears as she forced herself to speak. "I need to go home," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, though she could hear the tremble just beneath the surface. Grayson exhaled a soft chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "You keep saying that," he mused, as if the words amused him. "But I don't think you get it, kid." He crouched slightly, lowering himself just enough to be at eye level with her. The casual authority in his movements sent another wave of unease through her. "You think you can just walk away from this?" he murmured, tilting his head slightly. Her throat tightened. His eyes flicked over her face, watching her reaction. "I've seen your type before," he continued. "Mouthy. Think you're smarter than everyone else. Think you know how the world works." He smiled then, but there was nothing warm about it. "But the truth is, you don't." She clenched her jaw, gripping the ground beneath her fingers, using it as an anchor, as something to hold on to. "I didn't do anything," she said. The amusement in his expression darkened slightly. "See, that's where you're wrong," he murmured, straightening back to his full height. "You think what you do matters?" His voice was softer now, almost lazy, but his eyes remained sharp. "It doesn't. Not here. Not to anyone." The words settled like a stone in her stomach, heavy and suffocating. His boot scraped against the pavement as he took another slow step forward, his shadow stretching over her. Her breath caught. "You see, Sophia," he said, dragging out her name like he was tasting it, like it belonged to him now. "This city doesn't care about girls like you." She forced herself to move, to push herself up further, but his foot pressed lightly against the pavement near her knee, a subtle reminder of the power imbalance between them. "You know how many people have walked by since we've been standing here?" he asked, his tone conversational. "How many people saw and just kept going?" Her pulse pounded. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "All of them." The words sent a shiver through her. Her fingers curled into fists. He was right. She had seen the way that man turned away, had felt the weight of the world's silence pressing down on her like an unspoken rule, a quiet demand to accept the way things were, because people like Grayson thrived in that silence. He straightened again, exhaling through his nose. "You know what your problem is?" he mused. "You actually think you matter." Something snapped inside her. She didn't think. She moved, Her hand shot forward, grasping a loose chunk of gravel from the ground, her fingers curling around it in a tight grip. She barely had time to register her own actions before she threw it. The small rock struck him near the shoulder. It wasn't much. It wasn't nearly enough, but it was something. And for a fraction of a second, just a fraction, he looked surprised. Her window. She pushed up, scrambling to her feet, ignoring the sharp sting of her scraped palms. She twisted, her body moving before her mind could fully process it, sprinting toward the mouth of the alley. She had barely taken 2 steps before a hand closed around her wrist. The force of it yanked her backward so hard she nearly lost her footing. A shock wave of fear shot through her as she stumbled, her back colliding against something solid. Him. Grayson's grip was tight, unyielding. The air around them felt suffocating, and then, before she could even gasp, before she could twist away, he shoved her, hard. The world spun for a moment. Her body hit the pavement, a sharp jolt of pain shooting up her arm as she instinctively tried to break her fall. Her breath left her in a stunned exhale. She tasted blood. For a moment, everything was blurred. The neon lights from the street, the distant murmur of life moving on as if nothing had happened. She lay there, her pulse pounding, the taste of copper thick on her tongue. Above her, Grayson loomed. His expression was different now. The amusement was gone. Something darker had taken its place. A slow, creeping irritation, like she had disrupted the game. He adjusted his stance, his fingers tightening around his baton. The flickering street lamp above cast jagged shadows against his face. She wasn't sure if the pain in her chest was from the fall or the terror closing in around her like a vice, because this time there was no hesitation in his eyes. This time he wasn't playing. This time he had made his choice. And Sophia realized with cold, terrifying certainty. So had she. The air in the alley felt heavier, pressing down on Sophia's chest like an invisible weight. Her body ached from the fall, the sting of her scraped palms and elbows barely registering beneath the sharper, more immediate panic surging through her veins. Above her, Officer Grayson stood still for a moment, his expression unreadable, his shadow stretching long and jagged beneath the flickering street lamp. The smirk he had worn before was gone, replaced by something colder. He wasn't amused anymore. He was annoyed. Sophia's breath came in short, uneven gasps as she pushed herself up onto her elbows. She could taste the coppery tang of blood on her tongue. Her lip must have split when she hit the ground. The pain was dull, distant, overshadowed by the raw panic clawing its way up her throat. She needed to get up. She needed to move. But her limbs felt sluggish, her body locked in place by fear. Grayson let out a slow exhale, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off his irritation. Then he took a step forward. Sophia's pulse spiked. The sound of his boot scraping against the concrete sent a fresh wave of terror through her. She scrambled backward, her palms burning as they pressed against the rough pavement, but there was nowhere to go. The alley was too narrow, too confined. "Stay down," Grayson said, his voice low, edged with something that sent ice through her veins. Sophia ignored him, forcing herself up onto shaky legs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to do something. But Grayson moved faster. He lunged forward, grabbing the front of her jacket and yanking her forward so hard she nearly lost her footing. The force of it sent a sharp jolt of pain through her shoulder. Her hands shot up, grabbing at his wrist, trying to pry his grip loose, but he barely seemed to notice. His fingers dug into the fabric of her jacket, holding her in place with ease. He tilted his head slightly, studying her like she was some kind of puzzle he was trying to solve. "You don't listen very well, do you?" His voice was almost casual, but there was something dangerous beneath it, something that made her stomach twist. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to meet his gaze. She wouldn't beg. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. His grip tightened, and then, just as suddenly as he had grabbed her, he shoved her hard. Sophia staggered backward, barely managing to stay on her feet. The only thing that kept her from falling again was the wall behind her. She hit it with a dull thud, the cold brick pressing against her back. She sucked in a sharp breath, her ribs aching from the impact. Grayson stepped forward, closing the distance between them again. "See, this is the problem with kids like you," he mused, his tone almost thoughtful. "You think you're untouchable. You think the world cares about you." Sophia's hands curled into fists at her sides, nails biting into her palms. Grayson leaned in slightly, his breath warm against her skin. "But the truth is," his voice dipped lower, just above a whisper, "it doesn't." The words settled over her like a heavy weight, suffocating, final, and for a moment, just a moment, she felt the sinking dread of helplessness claw at her chest. No one was coming. No one was going to stop him. And he knew it. The baton in his hand tapped lightly against his thigh, a slow, rhythmic beat that sent a sick feeling rolling through her stomach. A warning, a threat. She needed to move. Now. She braced herself against the wall, her heart pounding so hard she could barely think. If she could just get past him, just reach the mouth of the alley. A sound. Soft, distant. Footsteps. For a brief second, Sophia thought it was just the city again. Another passing stranger, another face that would look the other way. But something felt different. Grayson must have felt it too. His body stiffened slightly, his head turning just enough to glance toward the entrance of the alley. Sophia followed his gaze. At first, she didn't see anything. The street beyond was still moving, people walking, cars passing. No one had stopped. No one was looking. And then, out of the sea of indifference, a presence. Someone stepped onto the sidewalk. Not just anyone. A man. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed simply. Jeans, a plain shirt, a faded denim jacket. There was nothing remarkable about his clothes, nothing that should have made him stand out. But he did. He didn't weave through the crowd. The crowd moved for him. People who hadn't even looked at the alley before seemed to instinctively shift aside as he walked, like they could feel something in the air, something they couldn't name but understood on some level. He walked with purpose, deliberate, unhurried, the kind of walk that didn't belong to a man uncertain of his place in the world. Sophia's breath caught. Grayson turned fully now, squaring his shoulders as the man reached the entrance of the alley. His grip on the baton tightened just slightly, his fingers curling around the handle. The man stopped just outside the alley, his face partially shadowed by the dim streetlight. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The air shifted. Sophia felt it before she fully understood it. The weight of control that had suffocated her moments ago, it had shifted. And for the first time since she had stepped into this alley, since she had made that one wrong turn, Grayson wasn't the one in power anymore. The tension between them was electric, thick enough to choke on. Grayson exhaled through his nose, rolling his shoulders back slightly. "Move along," he said, his voice flat, controlled. The man didn't move. Grayson's jaw tightened. "I said," the man took a step forward. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't rushed, but it was enough. Enough to make Grayson tense. enough to make Sophia's pulse spike for an entirely different reason, because something about the way the man moved, it wasn't casual. It was measured, calculated, like he already knew how this was going to end. Grayson shifted his weight, adjusting his stance. He wasn't afraid. Not yet. But he was aware. And Sophia, still pressed against the wall, still catching her breath, still feeling the ache of every bruise forming beneath her skin. She realized something, too. This wasn't just a bystander, not a passerby who had happened to glance down the alley at the right time. This was something else entirely. This was a reckoning. The alley was silent, but the air between the two men crackled with something tense and unspoken. Sophia could feel it even from where she stood, her breath still coming in uneven bursts as her body tried to recover from the shock of everything that had happened. She didn't know who this man was, but she knew with absolute certainty that Grayson did. Or at least, Grayson understood something about him in the way a predator recognizes another. This wasn't just some passerby who had stumbled upon an unfortunate scene. He was something else. Grayson squared his shoulders, the rigid set of his body betraying his irritation. He was used to having control, to people avoiding confrontation with him, and this was not how his night was supposed to go. He had expected fear, submission, not this, not a challenge. His fingers flexed around his baton, and Sophia saw the telltale shift in his weight, the calculation of a man who had already decided on his next move. The man in the denim jacket remained still. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't even raised his hands. He just stood there, watching. His presence alone was enough to unnerve Grayson, and for the first time that night, Sophia saw something unexpected flicker across the officer's face. Doubt. But doubt wasn't enough to make Grayson back down. His pride wouldn't allow it. He let out a slow breath, tilting his head slightly as if considering his options. Then, without breaking eye contact, he spoke. "You need to walk away." His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it now. Something forced. "This doesn't concern you." Still, the man didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even shift his stance. He was perfectly balanced, his muscles loose but ready, like a coiled spring waiting for just the right moment to snap into action. He had the kind of posture that belonged to someone who had seen 100 fights and won them all before the first punch was even thrown. Grayson took another breath, exhaling slowly through his nose. He was still trying to measure him up, still deciding whether this was worth pushing. His baton, once a casual threat, was now a necessity in his mind. Sophia saw it before it even happened. Grayson moved first. The baton came down in a sharp, controlled arc, aimed at the man's shoulder, a strike designed to disable, to send a message before escalating further. It was fast, precise, the kind of attack that had put plenty of people on the ground before, but it didn't land. The man sidestepped so smoothly it almost didn't seem real, his body shifting just enough for the baton to cut through empty air. Grayson barely had time to recover before the counterattack came. A fist drove into his solar plexus with brutal efficiency. The impact was immediate. Grayson's breath left him in a choked gasp, his body instinctively doubling over as he stumbled back a step. But the man didn't stop there. A second strike came, a sharp blow to the ribs, controlled, deliberate, not wild or rushed, but placed with exact precision. The kind of hit that wasn't just meant to hurt, but to take the fight out of someone. Grayson staggered, his boots scuffing against the concrete. He barely caught himself before he could fall, his face twisting into a snarl of pain and fury. Sophia couldn't breathe. She had seen fights before, petty scuffles in school, drunken brawls outside bars. But this wasn't like that. This wasn't two people throwing wild punches, hoping to land a lucky hit. This was something else. The man in the denim jacket wasn't fighting for sport. He was fighting to end things. Grayson gritted his teeth, shaking off the pain as best he could. His pride had been wounded more than his body, and that was dangerous. He wasn't going to accept this. He wasn't going to let himself be humiliated. This time he attacked with more caution, more control. He adjusted his grip on the baton, bringing it up with both hands now ready to use his full strength. His next move came faster. A low swing, aimed for the man's knee, a brutal, calculated strike meant to cripple an opponent before they could retaliate. It should have worked. It had worked before, but it missed. Not just missed, was countered. The man stepped into the attack. Not away, not back, into it. His hand snapped out, catching Grayson's wrist mid-swing, twisting it with sharp, unforgiving efficiency. Grayson grunted in pain, his grip faltering, and then the baton was gone. Sophia barely saw how it happened. 1 second, Grayson had the weapon. The next, it clattered against the pavement, skidding across the ground out of reach. Grayson reacted instantly, trying to pull free, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The man was already moving again. He used his own body weight to shift Grayson's balance, throwing him off center. And then, with a final, effortless motion, he took him down. Grayson hit the ground hard, his back slamming against the pavement with a force that knocked the breath out of him. For a moment, he just lay there, chest rising and falling rapidly, struggling to process what had just happened. The man stepped over him. Not aggressively, not tauntingly, just calmly. He looked down at Grayson, his expression unreadable, his breathing still controlled, still steady. Grayson tried to move, tried to reach for his belt. His fingers twitched toward his holster, toward the weapon still strapped there. And then the man moved one last time. His boot came down, not on Grayson's hand, but right beside it, firm, deliberate, a statement, not a threat. Don't. Grayson froze. For the first time since this encounter had begun, real fear entered his eyes. Sophia exhaled shakily, her limbs weak from the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She didn't know what was going to happen next. She didn't know if Grayson would try again, if he would let his humiliation turn into something worse. But she knew one thing for certain. Tonight, for the first time, he had lost. And someone had finally made him feel powerless. The man didn't say a word. He didn't gloat. He didn't taunt. He simply turned. His movements were as unhurried as they had been when he arrived. He walked away, back toward the mouth of the alley. And then, just like that, he was gone. The alley was still, but the echoes of what had just happened hung in the air like electricity after a storm. Sophia sat on the ground, her body aching from the impact of Grayson's shove, her hands scraped and stinging, but her mind was racing with something else entirely. She had just watched the impossible. She had just seen a man who had spent his entire life untouchable be taken down in seconds. And now he was lying on the ground, winded, humiliated, stripped of the power he had wielded so effortlessly just moments ago. Grayson groaned, rolling onto his side, his breath still uneven, his face twisted in pain and something darker. His pride had been wounded more than his body, and that was a pain he wasn't accustomed to feeling. He had spent years as the one in control, the one others feared, and now that control had been ripped away from him in an instant. His fingers twitched against the concrete, curling into a fist as if gripping at the last remnants of authority he had left. Sophia hadn't moved. She remained where she had fallen, watching as the scene before her shifted in a way she never could have anticipated. The stranger had stepped away from Grayson, his back turned, his silhouette outlined against the faint glow from the street beyond the alley. He did not gloat, he did not taunt. He simply left, as if what had just transpired required no further action. And maybe for him, it didn't. Grayson, however, was not done. A low growl of frustration rumbled from his chest as he pushed himself up, his limbs trembling slightly from the strain of the blows he had taken. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the veins in his neck stood out. He was not used to losing, not used to being on the receiving end of the kind of violence he so often inflicted. He was seething. Sophia saw the moment his mind shifted, the moment survival turned to revenge. His hand moved toward his belt, fingers grazing the holster at his side. Even in his weakened state, even with the weight of defeat pressing down on him, he was still a man with a weapon. But the stranger had not left yet. The moment Grayson reached for his gun, the man in the denim jacket turned. His movement was unhurried, controlled, but his eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, locked onto Grayson with an intensity that froze the officer in place. It was not fear that stopped him. It was the undeniable certainty that if he continued, the consequences would be swift and absolute. Grayson's fingers hesitated just above the holster, trembling in indecision. His breath came fast and sharp, his rage battling against something more primal, an instinct that told him he was no longer in control of this situation. The stranger took a single step forward. That was all it took. Grayson's hand dropped away from his belt. His lips curled in frustration. He wanted to fight back, wanted to reclaim the dominance he had lost. But some part of him, some deep animalistic part, understood that he had already lost. There was no salvage in this. Not now. A murmur stirred at the entrance of the alley. The crowd that had once ignored the unfolding scene had begun to change. Eyes that had previously averted were now fixed on the aftermath, drawn by something undeniable. Phones were out, cameras recording, the glow of their screens capturing evidence that would not be buried. Sophia felt her heartbeat quicken. For the first time, the city saw. Grayson must have felt it too. He turned his head slightly, his gaze darkening toward the figures gathering at the edges of the alley. Some stood in quiet disbelief, others murmured among themselves, but none of them moved to intervene. Not because they were afraid, but because they had already chosen a side. And it was not his. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Realization, perhaps, or the bitter taste of inevitability. Then came the sound, distant at first, barely a murmur against the city's constant hum. But then it grew. Sirens. Grayson's expression darkened. His body tensed as he looked toward the street, toward the approaching blue and red lights that reflected off the wet pavement. The approaching reality of what had just happened settled over him, and for the first time that night he looked uncertain. Sophia could hardly believe it. He was going to be held accountable. The stranger remained still, watching but making no move to stay. He had done what needed to be done. His presence had shifted the tides, had tilted the balance away from the men like Grayson and towards something closer to justice. But he had no intention of waiting to see how it ended. He turned again, this time with finality, and walked toward the mouth of the alley. His steps were as steady as they had been when he arrived, unaffected by the weight of what had just transpired. He was leaving. Grayson saw it too, and for a brief moment, something desperate flickered in his expression. He wanted to call out, to demand something, but no words came. There was nothing left to say, nothing he could do to undo what had already been set in motion. The crowd parted as the stranger stepped onto the sidewalk, blending into the city as seamlessly as he had emerged from it. He was gone. Sophia barely had time to process it before the police arrived. The cruisers skidded to a halt at the curb, doors bursting open as uniformed officers spilled into the street, their radios crackling, their hands hovering near their holsters, ready for anything. But what they found was not a riot, not chaos. They found their own. Grayson, bloodied, on the ground. His reputation shattered in the cold light of the street lamps. The scattered pieces of his authority lay around him, unseen but undeniable. One of the officers stepped forward, glancing between Grayson and the gathering crowd, then toward Sophia, who still sat against the wall, shaken but alive. "What happened here?" The words came, but no one answered immediately, not because they didn't know, but because they wanted it to be said aloud. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice rang out. "He attacked her." Another followed. "He shoved her to the ground." The murmurs swelled, a chorus of voices overlapping, each one a witness, each one a thread in the unraveling of Grayson's carefully protected power. The officer's gaze hardened. He turned toward Grayson, who had pushed himself upright but said nothing. There was nothing left for him to say. The evidence was overwhelming. The weight of the crowd against him was suffocating. "Check the security footage," the officer ordered one of his subordinates. "I want to see everything." Grayson flinched. He knew what they would find. He knew there would be no rewriting this story, no twisting it into something that fit his version of events. Justice was not blind tonight. Sophia inhaled deeply, the air sharp in her lungs. She was safe. But more than that, for the first time in a long time, the city did not feel quite so indifferent. Because tonight, someone had finally seen. The street was awash of flashing blue and red, the rhythmic pulse of sirens reflecting off the wet pavement like ghostly warnings. The hum of the city, which had for a time faded into the background, surged back to life in the form of murmuring voices, the crackle of police radios, and the distant honking of impatient drivers forced to reroute. The air smelled of exhaust and damp concrete, mingling with the electric tension still hanging over the scene. Sophia sat on the curb, her body still trembling from the adrenaline that had yet to fade. She pressed a palm to her stomach, grounding herself, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breath. The crowd had grown since the fight ended, drawn in by the spectacle, by the presence of uniformed officers surrounding one of their own. Grayson was still on the ground, his hands pressed against his knees, his face contorted in pain and anger. His uniform was rumpled, his dignity shattered, his illusion of invincibility stripped away under the unblinking gaze of cameras and witnesses. He had been untouchable once, a name spoken in warning, a figure feared but never challenged. But tonight, the city had finally seen him fall. Sophia turned her head, searching for the man who had saved her, the man in the denim jacket, the stranger who had stepped into the darkness and pulled her back into the light. But he was gone. Not a trace of him remained. It was as if he had never been there at all. She wasn't the only one looking. Some in the crowd glanced around, their eyes darting through the shifting bodies, scanning the street, the alleys, the doorways. The officers, too, cast quick glances toward the sidewalks, their brows furrowed as if expecting to find him standing nearby, watching. But there was nothing. He had vanished into the city, swallowed by the very streets from which he had emerged. The realization left Sophia with a strange sense of emptiness, a hollow awareness that she had witnessed something rare, something fleeting. The man who had fought for her, who had faced Grayson without fear, had not waited for thanks. He had not lingered for recognition or validation. He had simply done what needed to be done. And then he had disappeared. A firm voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Miss, are you all right?" She turned to find one of the officers crouched beside her, his expression serious but not unkind. His badge gleamed under the flashing lights, the reflection catching the hard lines of his face. Sophia opened her mouth to respond, but her throat was dry, her voice lost somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. She swallowed, forcing herself to focus, to find her words. She exhaled slowly. "I think so." The officer nodded, glancing down at the way she cradled her stomach. His gaze softened just slightly. "We're going to have paramedics check you out, just to be safe." Sophia barely had the energy to nod, her body still locked in the remnants of fear, but she accepted his words without protest. Across the street, another officer stood with Grayson, speaking in clipped, hushed tones. It was clear that no amount of rank would protect him now. The weight of what had happened was too much, too public. The footage, the witnesses, the undeniable truth that had unfolded under the flickering glow of street lamps. It had left no room for manipulation. Grayson's career was over. And yet, even in his defeated state, Sophia saw the way his hands clenched, the way his jaw tightened with a barely restrained fury. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't ashamed. He was simply enraged that for the first time he had been stopped. She turned away, unwilling to let him steal another second of her thoughts. The paramedics arrived, moving through the crowd with quiet efficiency. One of them, a woman with warm brown eyes and a steady voice, knelt beside Sophia and gently took her wrist, checking her pulse. "Do you feel any sharp pain?" she asked, her tone calm, professional. Sophia shook her head. "No, just shaken." The paramedic nodded in understanding, her hands moving to examine her elbow, where the worst of the impact had landed. There was a deep scrape, darkened with dirt and dried blood, but nothing appeared broken. "You're lucky," the paramedic said softly. "It could have been much worse." Sophia knew that. She had seen how close she had come to something far more terrible. The paramedic finished her assessment, giving her a reassuring nod. "We'll clean this up, but if you feel any dizziness or pain later, make sure you see a doctor. And if anything feels wrong, don't wait to get checked out." Sophia placed a hand over her stomach again, feeling the steady warmth beneath her fingertips. "I will," she promised. The crowd had begun to thin, the initial shock of the scene fading into the ordinary hum of the city. People had recorded what they needed, whispered what they had seen, and now, slowly, they were moving on. But as they left, they carried something with them. A story. One they would tell again and again. A story about a cop who had abused his power and had finally faced justice. A story about a man who had appeared out of nowhere, who had fought without hesitation, who had disappeared without a word. And that was how it would spread. Not just as another piece of urban legend, but as something real. A reminder that even in the depths of the city, where corruption thrived and fear silenced those who wished to speak, there were still those who would not stand by. Those who would act. Those who would not wait for permission to do what was right. Sophia watched as Grayson was finally led toward one of the police cruisers. His face was pale with barely restrained rage, but there was nothing he could do. The weight of the night pressed down on him, on the choices he had made, on the consequences he had never thought he would face. She turned away before they closed the door behind him. The officer from before returned to her side, his expression unreadable. "Do you know who that man was?" Sophia hesitated. She didn't know his name. She had never seen him before tonight, and yet she felt certain that she had always known his kind. "No," she said finally, "but I don't think that matters." The officer studied her for a moment, then nodded. It was an answer that felt more truthful than any name could have been. As she was helped to her feet, she cast one last glance toward the street, half expecting to see him standing there, watching. But of course, he wasn't. The night had swallowed him whole, just as it had done before. Just as it would again. And somewhere, in another part of the city, in another darkened alley where someone else might be crying out for help, he was already moving toward the next fight. Justice was served tonight, but how many times does the world turn a blind eye? How often do people look away when they should step in? Let's talk about it. What would you have done in this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video.